There are some things in this world that, despite being really fucking weird, are usually not recognized as being weird at all, or even given a second thought. Like the fact that most people, probably you included, have to work for someone else as their employee to make a living. And then some people don't, and instead have other people working for them. Or the fact that those who have others working for them are making money off the work that those other people do, and that they order them around and are like literally their boss. You know, I know we take all this stuff for granted because we're just so used to it, but it's really, really weird that anyone is the boss of anyone else. And possibly the weirdest thing about this is that these bosses, they like literally have the power to take away people's ability to feed themselves, you know, to afford food, to afford their home, to afford their basic needs for just, you know, life. That's a crazy amount of power for anyone to have over another person. And that's just like normal in our society for there to be this huge imbalance of power. It's fucking weird. It's fucking weird. You know, this entire dynamic it's a huge restriction on people's freedom in so many ways. And I know probably like there's at least some of you watching right now who are like, what? This isn't weird. What's wrong with that? This doesn't restrict people's freedom. What's she talking about? This woman's crazy. Just at least hear me out till the end of the video. And hopefully by the end, I don't think you'll think I'm crazy. At least not in this particular way about this particular thing. I don't know. So in an effort to make sense of all this weirdness and make sense of how it impacts our freedom and how it even got this way in the first place, it's time to tell you a true story. So gather round, cause it's story time.
Story time. Emotional, not clickbait.
Chapter 1. Without a servant to make his bed. Nearly 2 centuries ago, in 1830, a very wealthy man named Thomas Peel found himself facing misfortune. To quote from a book that was published at the time, Mr. Peel was without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river. And I know not having a servant to make your bed doesn't sound bad, but I think for rich people, that's like the equivalent level of misfortune as living in a tent in the park. You know, not having a servant to make your bed, that's like the rich guy equivalent of not even having a bed. So, poor, unfortunate Thomas Peel was accustomed to a much higher standard of living back home in Britain. But much like Dorothy was no longer in Kansas, Mr. Peel was not in Britain anymore. He had moved to Australia, and things were not going as planned. His plan was to become richer than ever, but that plan was failing miserably. And this miserable failure came as a huge surprise because Thomas Peel, it seemed like he had just like every ingredient necessary for financial success. So for starters, he had 50,000 pounds worth of capital, which adjusted for inflation would be like 4.7 million pounds in today's money, or $6 million US. And on top of that, the British Colonial Office had promised him an enormous amount of Australian land, 250,000 acres of it, which is 386 square miles or 1,000 square kilometers, which is a lot of land. It's actually more land than all of New York City combined, which, you know, that's a fucking lot of fucking land. And it's especially a lot of fucking land to get for free, which is what they were doing. They were giving him this land for free. All Mr. Peel had to do was like round up 400 British people who were willing to go live in Australia and then like pay for their transport. And that was it. He'd get all that land. Did you see that spit just fly? I'm sorry. So basically, Mr. Peel, he was playing a significant role in colonizing Australia, and he was doing it for profit. And he had all the ingredients that he thought he needed to succeed. He had that fortune of capital, all that enormous amount of free land. He had hundreds of men, women, and children who were coming from Britain to work for him and live there and be his employees and help make him rich. That was the plan, but once all these working class British people actually got to Australia, it wasn't long before they started to make plans of their own. And this led to Mr. Peel's plans being so completely ruined that he did not even have a servant to wait on him, which I guess that's what hitting rock bottom looks like when you're so rich that the only rocks you've ever known are diamonds. In the early period of colonizing Australia, a lot of the British settlers did not go there voluntarily. They were convicts, people convicted of crimes. And because they had broken the law, as their punishment, they were forcibly deported to Australia and forced to work as basically slave labor. Theirs was a temporary slavery, so it would only last as long as their prison sentence. So, they were indentured servants. But a lot of them just did not even survive long enough to see freedom. But the British workers who Mr. Peel had brought with him to Australia, they were not convicts. These were just people who were so poverty-stricken and so desperate for a job that they were willing to travel across the world for it. This was the 19th century, the peak of England's Industrial Revolution. The setting that inspired the grim stories of Charles Dickens, right? Like Oliver Twist and Tiny Tim and fucking Pip and all that. And now here they were in Australia, a land where they could stare off into the horizon in any direction and just see a vast expanse of land, which they believed was empty and unused. This belief was partly due to ignorance, partly due to racism, and partly probably due to wishful thinking. But the fact is that they were very, very wrong. The land was not empty, it was not unused. In fact, humans had been living in Australia for like 50,000 years, and they formed into many different sociocultural groups. And these Aboriginal peoples used the land in its entirety to obtain food and other necessities. But despite this, these British settlers that Thomas Peel had brought over, they wandered off and claimed pieces of land as their own. And they did not have to pay a penny for it. Now, there's a lot that could and should be said about colonialism in Australia, and a lot more than I can say in the scope of this video. But the main thing to know is that colonialism destroyed Aboriginal people's modes of subsistence, and by doing so, destroyed their ability to live freely and independently, which also resulted in cultural genocide. As Aboriginal people became dispossessed of their land, they needed new ways to survive. But those who attempted to join the labor force were rarely successful because employers preferred to hire white people. So without a direct mode of subsistence through the land and without opportunities for employment, most Aboriginal people ended up dependent on charity, or so-called charity. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, dependency on the state was actually institutionalized by a series of laws that forced Aboriginal people onto state-run reservations where they had to work without pay in exchange for the food and shelter that the state was providing. So that's a very brief overview of how Australian colonialism impacted Aboriginal peoples. But for the purposes of this story, our focus must go back to Mr. Thomas Peel. He had brought hundreds of people from Britain to be his employees, but instead of sticking around on his land to work for him, they ventured off to get their own land and work for themselves. So as a result, they all became independent farmers. And as for Mr. Peel, he found himself with plenty of money, plenty of land, but no one to work for him. Now, I hope that it's clear that I'm not trying to celebrate the fact that settlers from Britain got economic freedom by stealing indigenous people's land. I hope we can all agree that that shit is very, very, very bad. But I'm not telling this story because it's praiseworthy. I'm telling the story because it reveals an important fact. And that fact is that if people can make a living independently, they're probably not going to be willing to work for someone else. Now, hearing me say that, it might just sound very obvious, but this is something that often goes overlooked and unrecognized. But anyways, this explains why Mr. Thomas Peel was, to repeat the quote from earlier, left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river. That quote, by the way, is from another wealthy British man who colonized Australia, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, and he has some very interesting things to say about colonial Australia in the 1830s. Though specifically, he wasn't talking about Australia as a whole, but about the Swan River colony in Western Australia. His thoughts can be summarized in this one short quote.
The last colony founded by Englishmen has severely felt the want of slavery.
Okay, so Mr. Wakefield was of the opinion that Australia, which is the colony he was referring to, was in need of slave labor. And here's another quote where he explains why he believed this to be true.
In this colony, there never has been a class of laborers. Those who went out as laborers no sooner reached the colony than they were tempted by the superabundance of good land to become landowners.
So obviously a class of laborers did eventually become a thing in Australia. But Wakefield's complaint that workers brought to Australia would, instead of going to work for capitalists like Mr. Peel, would just go grab land and become independent farmers. He said that in a book that he wrote back in 1833, and he accurately describes what things were like at the time. Wealthy capitalists like Thomas Peel, they just could not convince anyone to work for them. It just wasn't happening. So, to once again quote Mr. Wakefield,
"They are now begging for supply of convict labor. They want slaves. Not having convict labor, they will long for African slaves, and would obtain them too, if public opinion in England did not forbid it."
This Wakefield guy, it seems like he's not a big fan of public opinion being anti-slavery, you know? That's the vibe I'm getting. He's all like,
"Yes, to be a slave is unfortunate indeed, but have you considered the misfortune of a wealthy capitalist who resides in a region where there are not only no slaves, but also no one who is destitute and desperate? My God. Indeed, people can simply choose to reject wage labor, without that choice resulting in starvation. Many tears have been shed for the slaves, but tell me, what of the capitalists? Who shall weep for the capitalists?
Oh, won't somebody please think of the
Capitalists. Pass me a brandy.
the poor, unfortunate capitalists could not convince free people to work for them, which is why they wanted to use some form of unfree labor. If not slaves, then convicts from the UK and Ireland who were forced to work as indentured servants. But here's the thing. Wakefield, he talks about colonial Australia as if it's like this very unusual thing for capitalists to need unfree labor, right? As if under normal circumstances, free people will just freely choose to work for an employer. But is that actually true? Supposedly, this is how things were back in England, right? Just free people freely choosing to work for capitalists in their factories, in their workshops, in their mines, in their mills, in their farms, in their homes. But Wakefield openly admits that the reason why workers were doing this in England, but not in Australia, is because in Australia they could just go off and get land for free or for extremely cheap, but in England they could not, because the land in England was generally beyond what working class people could afford. So in England, because they did not have the land they needed to survive independently, their survival depended on being employed and being paid a wage. They were wage dependent, so they had no choice but to go and work for somebody who is rich enough to pay them a wage. That's the result of wage dependency, right? You must work for someone else due to lack of choice, with lack of choice being another way to say lack of freedom. So the working class from England, they were also unfree labor, not nearly as unfree as convict labor, let alone slave labor. Definitely actual slavery is a whole lot fucking worse. But they were still a long way off from being truly free. And this not being truly free, this is something that applies not just to 19th century workers in Britain, but to workers in any time and place, including today, and including wherever you live. Eventually, a lot of the people who had refused to work for Mr. Peel, they came back to him and they asked for a job. But they only did this because their efforts to be independent farmers had failed and they were starving. Because it's hard, it's hard to eke out a living on land that you're not familiar with. First of all, most of these people were probably just working class people who had never done any farming in their life. Others who might have been peasants initially, like they were used to conditions back in England where the weather patterns and climate and so on and in the soil conditions like going to be quite different from Australia. So they were just not used to what things were like over there. And most importantly, even though they had free land, they did not have seeds, they did not have plows or other farming equipment, they did not have access to an irrigation system. So they didn't have access to the things they needed to farm successfully, and they had no money to buy these things. So a lot of them had to go back to Mr. Peel and beg for a job. But this does not undermine the point of the story. It actually just reinforces it. That a capitalist only has power when other people lack the resources to survive independently. That's the only way a capitalist can get people to work for them. And that if people have these resources, then they're probably not going to go and work for someone else. Or, maybe they would, but they would only do it if the conditions were so good that they actually felt it was worth their time, rather than just because oh no, if I don't get this job, I'm going to starve. I'm going to not be able to afford food. I won't have a place to live. I'm going to lose my health insurance. Doing it under those conditions, that's doing it under duress, where you're literally afraid for your survival. That's not a truly free choice. In other words, people who go and work for an employer are generally doing so not under a context of freedom, but a context of coercion. Now, just to be clear, I'm not trying to argue that in 2024, most people would rather be an independent farmer rather than whatever job they currently have now. For one thing, most people today just don't know how to farm. They don't know how to grow food. They don't have those skills. And most people don't live in the countryside, and they probably wouldn't want to move there and just be so far away from their friends and their family and give up the urban lifestyle that they've known their whole life. But to focus on that misses the point, because the point is not that people would prefer to be independent farmers rather than wage workers. The point is that it's that the only way to have a society where people are divided into those who work for others and those who have others work for them is to ensure that those who work for others don't really have a choice, to ensure that their other options for survival or for a decent standard of living have all been removed. And this lack of choice is rooted in the fact that most people do not have access to the resources that they need to make a living, whether those resources are land or, in a more modern context, just the means of production more broadly. And I just think that this situation is such an offense, an insult to the value of people's lives, to the sanctity of life itself, to squander lives in this way. You cannot live a life that you freely choose, live the path of your own choosing. Instead, they are forced and coerced into being someone's employee and to be, used for their agenda as that person's human tool, as that company or corporation's human tool. Someone else is determining their course of life. People deserve better than this. You deserve better than this. I want better than this for everyone, including those of you who cook me with cruel comments. I think if we truly respect life and we respect people's lives, then people should be free to live lives of their own choosing. And that's not what's happening here. People are making choices, yes, but they're making those choices within a context of coercion. It's such a sad fucking waste that people are forced to sell the hours and days and years of their life, sell huge pieces of their life to another person or company, and spend that part of our life under someone else's command, doing a job we probably don't even like, don't see value in, and just feels empty and meaningless and purposeless, and we're why are we even here? I mean, some people are lucky that they do see value in the job that they're doing, but a lot of people don't, because often there's really kind of not. There's a lot of bullshit jobs going on in this world. And that, my friends, is just one reason why our current economic system, capitalism, should be kicked to the curb, burned to the ground, and thrown into the trash can of history. In my opinion, at least. And it's why I advocate alternative economic systems that would greatly enable freedom and equality. And a few of these alternative systems are described in my video, Post-Capitalism, a detailed look at how it could work. Link is in the video description if you'd like to check it out. Chapter 2, A Kickstarter for Capitalism. Our story continues by going further back in time. Way back during the Middle Ages, all the land of England technically belonged to the crown, which is to say it belonged to the state. But this coexisted with overlapping property rights. So large quantities of land were held by the nobility or aristocracy, my lord, my lordship, those fucking people. These lords owned titles to the land. They were land-owning lords or landlords, a cursed word with cursed origins. And the church also owned huge amounts of land, and even some peasants owned small amounts of land, usually just enough to feed their family. However, most peasants did not own land. They did have access to land, but this was not land that they owned. It was just land that they had use rights to, which just means that they had the right to use it. Though this right came at a price. They had to pay the lord who owned the title to the land that they were on, to pay a portion of their harvest to the lord, or to pay the lord in labor by working for him, or often to do both. So to recap, the crown owned all the land, lords held titles to land, and of the land that belonged to the lords, it was divided between land that was used for the lord's own purposes and land that the peasants used for themselves. That was the general pattern. Of the land that the peasants had use rights to, a lot of it was not for use by just any particular individual or family. A lot of it was shared. So in the village, there would be land that every villager could use. So they could bring their sheep or goats or cattle or whatever animals they had to just graze on the grass. And anyone could wander into a nearby field or forest, and they could gather firewood or chop down trees to build a home. You could gather fruit or mushrooms or nuts or whatever was growing. And you could also hunt animals in the forests or fish in the rivers. Now, I'll just say, when people kill animals or they pay for the killing of animals because they like how those animals taste, this is not justified. Taste buds should not matter more than lives. But killing animals because you're a peasant with hardly any options for food and you're just struggling not to die of malnutrition, killing animals in that context deserves a pass. When it's an issue of necessity, that makes it entirely different from the type of choice that most of us face regarding this issue. Anyways, this shared land, both field and forests, was called the commons, or common land. Why? Because the term in common means in joint use or possession, and this land was held and used in common by all the peasants in a village. But then, from the 12th century onward, that slowly began to change. Some landlords started to turn common land into their own private land. They put up fences and hedges to keep people out, and they punished anyone who went in. This was called enclosure because these lands became closed off and closed in. The landlords took this once common land that was now their private land, and they used it for their own economic gain. For example, many of them started to graze flocks of sheep on the land, because in the 12th century, when enclosure was beginning, sheep's wool was becoming an increasingly profitable commodity. So for landlords, enclosure was profitable, and for peasants, enclosure was a disaster. They were suddenly cut off from land that they had relied on for basic necessities, especially food. And enclosure wasn't just being done by the landowning lords, it was also done by the king. And to hear a bit more about that, I'll just play you this clip from Astra Taylor giving one of her lectures for the 2023 CBC Massey Lectures, which she titled The Age of Insecurity.
In 13th century England, almost 1/3 of the country was designated as forest, a legal term that described land enclosed for royal use and governed by forest law, a system that hoarded natural resources for the crown, making it harder for regular people to survive. Like rulers before him, King John and his enforcers capriciously infringed on the peasants' customary rights to subsistence, rights to fish in the streams and let their animals forage and graze, to gather nuts, berries, honey, kindling, and herbs for medicine. The king's minions charged the needy fees to enter the woods and fined or killed trespassers without recourse or remorse.
Fining and killing trespassers. That is some naked fucking brutality by the rich against the poor. No wonder Robin Hood stories were so popular back then.
You think I hand my purse to every rough lout who asks for it?
Hands up, nigga, it's game time. Hand over the ring, check over the chain. Give me the fucking watch before I pop one in your brain.
See, Sir Abbot? But we're only poor outlaws with nothing to eat but the king's deer, while you have property, rents, and silver. So, your purse.
Enclosure did not happen to all the common land all at once. It was done gradually over the course of centuries. The historian Janet M. Neeson says that, quote, much of England was still open in 1700, but most of it was enclosed by 1840. The 17 and 1800s were a time when the Industrial Revolution came rising up, and a new wave of enclosures rose up with it, a new wave of peasants losing land they had used for their survival. So, what was a peasant to do? Some of them, they had enough of their own land that they could survive without the commons, but many of them were not so lucky. Among these not-so-lucky peasants, some of them just straight up died. Most of them did manage to survive, but could only do so by finding some other way to make a living. For some peasants, this meant spending more time working for the local lord. But usually there was just not enough jobs in the local community, so a lot of peasants had to migrate from the countryside and go to the towns and cities looking for a job. Which means that these peasants were transformed into the working class. Such was the fate of countless men, women, teenagers, and even young children. This is why historians, political scientists, and other scholars have pointed out that enclosing the commons is what helped to kickstart capitalism. And isn't kickstart just like the perfect term here? Because there's actual kicking involved, right? Kicking the peasants off the land and even giving them a metaphorical kick to the balls. And the reason all this kicking helped capitalism to get started is because when peasants were kicked off the land, many of them could no longer feed themselves. And so now the only way they could feed themselves is by getting paid to work for someone else. These somebody else's that they worked for were people who owned factories and mills and mines and even commercial farms. These were people who belonged to the new up-and-coming economic class, which came to be known as the capitalist class. That's a class defined by the fact that, one, they own economic resources, which are productive resources that are often called capital. Two, they employ people to use those resources to make things. And three, they sell those things for profit. So if you're, like a Fox News host or someone like that, you're going to think of these capitalists as job creators. Oh, gee, lucky thing for the peasants that these capitalists were there to give them jobs. What heroes. That's one way to look at it. But another way is that it was actually lucky for the capitalists that these desperate, starving peasants were there to do these jobs, right? And that they were desperate enough and starving enough to just accept whatever shitty-ass working conditions and shitty fucking pay was being offered to them. Capitalists were making money not just because they owned factories and mines and so on, but because they were able to get people to work for them in those factories and mines. Right? It's the workers who are actually going and hammering those nails, spinning the cloth, going down into the mines and, getting the minerals out of the earth. The workers are the ones who do the actual work. It's in the fucking name. Without workers, the capitalists could not have made a single penny. But with workers, they were making a fortune. Though most of these capitalists actually had a fortune to begin with, right? Because most of them, they came from wealthy families of lords, the land-owning lords, and that land and wealth and so on had been passed down through the generations, though originally it had come from military conquest. Back in the year 1066, England got a new king, William the Conqueror, and he was called that because, well, he conquered England. Makes sense. King William the Conqueror divided most of the land of England among 180 barons, and then those barons went and divided their land among their own followers. So in other words, the landowners of England got their wealth by violent conquest, and then this land and the wealth that it produced was passed down in families for centuries. And now the younger generations of these families were using some of that wealth, were using some of that wealth to buy factories and employ workers, and they were doing that so that their wealth would expand and grow. And it was a perfect time for this. It was the Industrial Revolution, so there was advances in technology that were making new levels of economic productivity possible. And simultaneously, the enclosing of the commons was sending a flood of peasants from the countryside to the towns and the cities, and those peasants all came searching for a job that they desperately needed for their survival. So truly, the enclosing of the commons was a huge gift to the new and growing capitalist class. They had people not only willing to work for them, but desperate to work for them, even if it meant long hours, low pay, and lowly conditions. And it absolutely did mean that. Chapter 3: Subordination of the Lower Ranks of Society. So the fact that the enclosures of the commons were a gift to the capitalists is something that some of them were willing to admit, shamelessly and openly. And here's an interesting quote about that.
The use of the common land by labourers operates upon the mind as a sort of independence.
So those are the words of a wealthy gent named J. Bishton, and he wrote them in 1794 in a report for the Board of Agriculture. And in his view, this independence that the laborers had, it was a problem in need of a solution, and that solution was to enclose the commons. Because once you take their land and therefore take their independence, then, and here's another quote,
"The laborers will work every day in the year. Their children will be put out to labor early."
Oh, good, because that's one thing that was wrong with 18th century peasants. Their children didn't start working early enough. I think some of them actually made it to their 10th birthday without even working their way to a back injury. Shameful. Where's the Protestant work ethic when you need it? Anyways, so this Bishton guy also wrote that enclosing the commons would have another benefit, which was
subordination of the lower ranks of society, which in the present times is so much wanted, would be thereby considerably secured.
subordinating the lower ranks of society. That was the goal. As for the higher ranks of society, some of them thought that more should be done to subordinate the lower ranks beyond just enclosing the commons. This was the opinion of a landowner named Thomas Rudge, and Mr. Rudge advised that when landowning lords put up hedges to enclose common lands, the hedges to keep the peasants the hell out of their land, that those hedges should be the type that do not grow fruit. Because if they do grow fruit, a peasant might be wandering by and eat the fruit for free. Apparently, that's a terrible, terrible thing, according to Mr. Rudge. And he explains why in something that he wrote in 1807.
"The idle among the poor are already too prone to depredation, and would still be less inclined to work if every hedge furnished the means of support."
Free fruit would make the poor less inclined to work. So clearly, this is somebody who understood that only the threat of starvation was going to make people willing to take the shitty jobs that were available. Another example of capitalists openly admitting to their desire for a poor and desperate working class comes from Arthur Young of Lincolnshire, who wrote the following in 1771.
"Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor, or they will never be industrious. They must be, like all mankind, in poverty, or they will not work."
This sentiment is also found in a pamphlet written by William Temple, a capitalist who owned cloth manufacturing factories. He said,
"The only way to make the poor industrious is to lay them under the necessity of laboring all the time they can spare from rest and sleep, that is, in order to procure the common necessities of life."
Make sure that they have to spend every single waking moment working just to afford the basics. Good plan. I really don't think there is a difference in how capitalists thought back then and how they think today. They're just a little smarter to be quiet about it now than they used to be, though not always.
I think the problem that we've had is that we have people decided they didn't really want to work so much anymore through COVID, and that has had a massive issue on productivity. Tradies have definitely pulled back on productivity. They have been paid a lot to do not too much in the last few years. And we need to see that change. We need to see unemployment rise. Unemployment has to jump 40, 50% in my view. We need to see pain in the economy. We need to remind people that they work for the employer, not the other way around. I mean, there's been a systematic change where employees feel the employer is extremely lucky to have them, as opposed to the other way around. So it's a dynamic that has to change. We've got to kill that attitude, and that has to come through hurting the economy, which is what the whole global the world is trying to do. The governments around the world are trying to increase unemployment to get that to some sort of normality.
So the unemployment rate's got to rise.
Unemployment rate's got to rise. This is what Michelle Bullock was saying yesterday at a speech.
Unfortunately, you're going to have to see the unemployment rate go up.
Good news is bad news. The labour market is strong, wage gains are strong, but this may well be bad news from the Bank of Canada's perspective. They don't want to see wage gains strong. They don't want to see low unemployment. They would like to see higher unemployment and slower wage gains in particular.
I'm just going to say what everybody's thinking. We need fewer jobs. We need a higher unemployment rate.
And here's a quote from John Clark, who wrote the following in 1794, offering some advice for how to solve a labor shortage in the county of Herefordshire.
The farmers in this country are often at a loss for labourers. The enclosure...
That's too much. Okay.
The farmers... wait, let me try. The farmers in this country are often at a loss for labourers. The enclosure would increase the number of hands for labour by removing the means of subsisting in idleness.
This complaint that farm owners can't find workers because the workers have it too good, it's just something about it just seems familiar. Unbounded freedom ruled the wandering scene, nor fence of ownership crept in between. Enclosure came and trampled on the grave of labor's right and left the poor a slave. That's from an 1827 poem by John Clare, who was the son of a peasant farm laborer. And this reference to slavery is due to the profound loss of freedom that peasants experienced after enclosure. Because when their land and independence was taken away, this created a dependency on a wage. Their survival became dependent on working for another person in exchange for a wage. This is not freedom. You're not working for someone else because you're making a free choice. You're doing it because you have no choice. And this creates a huge power imbalance between you and your employer. There's a reason the person you work for is called a boss. They have the power to tell you what to do, how to do it, and for how many hours a day. And if you don't like it, you have to go work for someone else. But of course, that someone else also gets to be a dictator. When peasants lost the commons, they lost power and lost freedom. But just to be clear, they were not powerful before this, and they certainly were not truly free. But whatever degree of power and freedom they did have was now diminished. So, what did the British government do about all this? After all, a huge portion of the British population was becoming more poor and desperate than they ever had been. They were working longer hours. They were living in filthy, disease-ridden slums. Things were bad. So surely the British members of Parliament would want to do something about this, right? Well, they sure did do something, but that something was to make things even worse. On purpose. According to Peter Linebaugh, a historian who specializes in British history, in the 100 years between 1725 and 1825, the British Parliament passed nearly 4,000 acts that enclosed 6 million acres of common land, which is 1/6 of all the land of England. God save the motherfucking Queen, that's a lot of land. Oh my God, why would the government do such a thing? I can't imagine why. Could it be because the members of Parliament were lords and landowners and capitalists, the very same people who were profiting off of keeping the majority of the population in a state of poverty and desperation? Yeah, I think that might have been the reason. Well, it's a good thing that our governments today aren't like that anymore, right? Yeah, we've come a long way. Fuck.
Boosted by pandemic assistance programs and an abundance of jobs as economies reopened after the COVID-19 lockdowns, people felt less pressure to please their employers and more emboldened to seek out better compensation and treatment, even as rates of inflation and costs of groceries, gas, and rent spiked. As a result of this sudden increase in federal income support, millions of people, my sister among them, felt materially secure enough to leave jobs where they felt disrespected, abused, unhappy, bored, underpaid, unable to advance. And this led to a historic quit rate. Employers were less than thrilled. The Financial Post reported in late 2022 that the actions of a newly, quote, empowered workforce had caused, quote, a growing sense of anxiety among bosses. Official monetary policy in the US and Canada helped strengthen the boss's hand. In other words, it would suppress wages by making job insecurity intense enough that workers would stop asking for more.
From the Bank of Canada's perspective, they don't want to see wage gain strong. They don't want to see low unemployment.
800 years after the privatization of the English commons commenced, the old logic of enclosure reverberates from the current centers of government and high finance as they impose insecurity on ordinary people for the benefit of current and future employers. Government shut down the pandemic assistance programs as quickly as they had started up, not because these programs were too costly or ineffective, but, I am arguing, because the material security they provided was a threat to the economic status quo.
Chapter 4, Theft of the Commons, an ancient, even prehistoric practice. Tell me in the comments if you've noticed this, but I find that when people talk about the theft of common land, usually they talk about the story we just heard, about the enclosures in England. And that makes me exasperated. You know, I find myself quite frustrated because people talk about the enclosures like it's the first time that men armed with swords or law books robbed people of their fucking land. And it's like, dude, come on. That shit has been happening for thousands of years. That is an old ass story. I mean, it used to be just like normal for people everywhere to just have free access to the land that was around them and all the resources on that land. But over the past several thousand years, that has gradually changed. Humankind as a species is about 200,000 years old, which is, you know, pretty young if you think about it. It's just 2,000 Henry Kissingers, which kind of a terrible way to measure anything. I'm sorry. If you look at the best available evidence for what humanity has been up to for these past 200,000 years, it suggests that for the vast majority of this time, most of us were living in societies that were egalitarian. So basically, these were societies of equality, both economically and politically. To quote anthropologist Douglas P. Fry, egalitarian hunter-gatherer band society is the oldest and simplest form of human social organization, extending back over humanity's evolutionary past. In these egalitarian societies, everyone had free use of the land and all the resources that the land provided. This was likely due to land being shared as a commons, communal sharing of land and resources going back deep into our prehistoric past. And because of this, nobody could make anybody else work for them. And this really helped to equalize the power that people had in relation to each other. People in these societies also had a level of freedom that few people alive today have experienced. And that's because the power relations between people were quite equal, because it really takes an imbalance or inequality of power in order to constrict someone's freedom. People cannot just constrict your freedom unless they have power over you. So the fact that power relations between people were quite equal really enabled people to have freedom. In other words, it was the equality between people that made possible their freedom. It would be wrong to assume that all prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies were egalitarian, but the evidence suggests that the majority of them were, which is pretty fucking cool. So this tells us that when it comes to human social relations and the types of societies we create, that human beings have different potentials. It's very clear that we have the potential for inequality and for dominance hierarchy, but we also have the potential for egalitarianism. So that's a relief, right? Next time you're feeling pessimistic about our species, just remember, there is hope for us. But how can anyone possibly have any idea about what life was like so long ago? One primary source for this knowledge is the evidence unearthed, literally unearthed by archaeologists. And here's a little quote about this from a book called Prehistoric Hunter-Gatherers: The Emergence of Cultural Complexity. It says, "The archaeological record does directly suggest that egalitarian structures were the rule in early prehistory." Our other source of knowledge about prehistory comes from anthropologists, and anthropologists gather their evidence by studying various types of societies, including societies of hunter-gatherers, both egalitarian and non-egalitarian, that have existed in the last few hundred years. And anthropologists have studied these societies not from a distance, but by actually living in and participating in these societies, and then documenting their experiences and observations. And there are just like so many interesting things about egalitarian hunter-gatherers that I would love to share, but just don't have time to. But a great learning resource is the channel What is Politics, particularly the playlist Political Anthropology. And the guy who does this channel is himself an anthropologist, so it's good stuff. Check it out. Anyways, those are our main sources of evidence: anthropology and archaeology. Neither is perfect or complete, but together they make a pretty awesome team and can provide us with quite credible information about the distant past. Now, I'm not saying that the evidence that suggests that egalitarianism was the norm during prehistory, that this is like 100% absolute conclusive proof that this is definitely totally true. Because, just that level of certainty about prehistory is just not possible. And perhaps non-egalitarian societies were a lot more common than can be determined by the available evidence. But even if that were to be true, we could still safely say that egalitarian societies, at the very least, were frequent enough during prehistory that they were definitely not rare. So it's not known when this began to change, but when we look at the evidence gathered by archaeologists, there is some ambiguous evidence for possible inequality as early as 34,000 years ago. But evidence going back that far has only been found in Europe, and the evidence is also too weak to be conclusive. It's not solid proof. The evidence is open for interpretation of whether it indicates inequality or not. A lot of the evidence for prehistoric inequality is, open for interpretation. But starting about 10 or 12,000 years ago, the evidence becomes increasingly clear. And it shows that from that period of time forward, inequality gradually spread around the world over the course of thousands of years. And if you're wondering how and why inequality developed and spread, this is a question or topic that I will be examining in a couple of future videos that I've been working on. So if that interests you, make sure you've subscribed and clicked the bell to select all notifications. But even as societies were becoming unequal, in many cases, people retained access to some sort of commons, to land or other resources that were shared by a kinship group or by everyone in the village. Now, in societies where land was the common property of a kinship group, this land could be shared collectively by the entire group, or in other cases, it was divided up between families or even individuals, or there could be a mix of both types of land tenure arrangements. So some of the land would be shared by the entire kinship group, other land would be divided up between families or individuals. So there was different possibilities, but whatever it is that they did, the kinship group always ensured that every member of the group had enough land to support themselves. And just to quickly give an example, I'll quote anthropologist Mark Bussey, which is a last name that sounds exactly like a word that now has a particular meaning. I won't say what that meaning is. If you know, you know. Anyways, Mr. Bussey says, on Tikopia, for example, land was owned by patrilineal descent groups called Paito, but individual members of Paito cultivated particular plots of land as their own. At the same time, chiefs had the right to request contributions of food produced on any land, regardless of the paito to which it belonged. This mention of chiefs having the right to request, or actually demand, food contributions brings us to the next point. Eventually, if a society's level of inequality reached a high enough level of severity, people's access to land no longer came for free, whether that was common land or land just used by you and your family. When societies became unequal and developed economic hierarchies and political hierarchies, these hierarchies were made possible by institutions of violence and coercive power. And the elites of society used these coercive powers to take control of land and resources that everyone had been using for free for like thousands of generations, like however fucking long human beings had been alive. But now, people's use of land and resources came in a context of being exploited by elites. Those motherfuckers. So here I'd like to quote to you from a book called The Prehistory of Private Property by Carl Widerquist and Grant McCall. And in this quote, they're disgusting chiefdoms. Disgusting chiefdoms, not disgusting chiefdoms. What? So just real quick, chiefdoms, they're a stateless but still very hierarchical society that is headed by a type of hereditary ruler that anthropologists call a chief, hence the term chiefdom. Anyway, so as part of their discussion of chiefdoms, Widerquist and McCall say the following. The chiefs and the elite group can have varying levels of authority. Some chiefdoms are extremely inegalitarian, with powerful rulers, rigid class distinctions, and sometimes even slavery. In larger societies, chiefs might command powers of life and death over their subjects. But individuals might retain traditional rights of access to the land, along with an obligation to pay tribute to a now fixed class of elites. Common access rights to the land are the norm. What varies most is the level of control chiefs can exert over that community and the tribute they can extract from the people in exchange for their leadership and protection. So, as Widerquist and McCall point out in their book, even in societies as unequal as chiefdoms, and also later on in states, it was not unusual for people to have access to common land. But again, this access did not come for free. The usual payment was a portion of your harvest paid to the chief, or as was the case in various states, including medieval European states, peasants would pay a portion of their harvest to the lord or the aristocrat or member of the nobility on whose land they lived. And payment could also be demanded in the form of labor. Like in ancient states and also some chiefdoms, the ruler would occasionally conscript people to do forced labor. And this forced labor would be towards projects for like public works, like irrigation systems, roads, buildings, monuments, though it would also be used for like giant statues and tombs to glorify the ruler and like feed his pathetic bottomless pit of an ego.
I don't always conscript people into temporary slavery, but when I do, I prefer they build a giant monument of my face.
Good times. In societies like this, even though common lands were still pretty common, still not unusual, these were not the egalitarian commons found in egalitarian societies, where everyone had free and equal access to the land. In other words, the commons got transformed from something that was truly egalitarian to something that was now controlled by rulers and elites. However, eventually, even these common lands were lost, though lost is not the accurate term here. They were not lost, they were stolen. This outright thievery of the commons has been occurring since ancient times, even prehistoric times, but it's in recent centuries that theft of the commons really took off. Beginning in 1492 and then continuing into the 20th century, most of the world was colonized by various European nation-states through violent conquest. Now, conquest and colonialism had been going on for long before this, thousands and thousands of years in every region of the world. But one of the consequences of this modern colonialism was that eventually much of what was left of the commons was turned into private property and sometimes also state property. And during this period, common land was also being stolen even in the places of the world that were not being colonized at this time. Like, for example, the way it was in England with the Enclosure movement that was turning common land into the private property of wealthy lords. And just like the Enclosures helped kickstart capitalism in the UK, modern colonialism was helping to kickstart capitalism all around the world. Because through colonialism, people were dispossessed of their land, or they were forced to pay taxes on that land to the colonial government. And this forced millions and millions of people into the labor market. But states violently dispossessing people of their land hasn't only been done in service of kickstarting capitalism. States have also violently dispossessed people of their land in service of other systems of exploitation, both ancient and modern. And shamefully, this includes systems created by leaders of communist parties, those who claimed that they were putting an end to exploitation and oppression. The Soviet Union is a prime example. The Communist Party, they didn't just take land from the big landowners. They also expropriated land from poor peasants. They turned that land into state property, and then they forced those peasants to work on what were basically state-run plantations. This is summed up by Carl Widerquist and Grant McCall in their book, The Prehistory of Private Property. The Soviet Union's so-called collectivization was essentially another version of enclosure. It replaced traditional shared access with a top-down structure so that individuals who had enjoyed direct access to the land for centuries became dependent laborers under the direction of a government-sanctioned person who took over and sometimes extended the lord's authority, but who was no longer officially called a lord. So it was basically state bureaucrats who took over the role of lord as the dominating, ruling, and oppressive exploitive force in a particular area. Good job, guys. The theft of the commons has gone down a little differently in each country, but it has been a global pattern for thousands of years, and the theft has always been made possible by violence. In its most extreme form, this violence has been brutal and bloody genocide and slavery, which has often been a part of conquest and colonialism since ancient times. But even when the commons were stolen by legal means that are supposedly peaceful, just by the government coming and making a law being like, this is now private property, this is now state property, even that relies on violence. Because the way the law has power in a state is that the state uses violence to enforce its laws. If you break the law, the state sends people with weapons to go put you in a big cage known as prison. Anyways, the result of this history is that despite living most of our 200,000 years as a species in a world where most of us had access to common land, we now live in a world where common land is extremely uncommon. When the commons was ripped away from us, it took away our ability to meet our basic needs for food and shelter and to make a living independently. We became dependent on employment for survival, and that made us dependent on our employers. This dependency on them is what forces us to work under their authority and command, under conditions that they choose and control, and puts our ability to afford food and shelter at their mercy. Total free society that we're living in. Definitely. Freedom, freedom, freedom.
The history of enclosure reminds us that this arrangement is anything but natural. Capitalism, Denning writes, begins not with the offer of work, but with the imperative to earn a living. In other words, it begins with manufactured insecurity. Manufactured insecurity.
Chapter 5: Reclaiming Our Freedom.
In this video, we've seen that when people have access to the things that they need for survival, this makes it possible for them to live free from exploitation. And when people can only access what they need for survival through somebody else, then that traps them in exploitation. That's true whether it's about accessing land or accessing a wage that you need to purchase the things you need to survive. In Britain, the land that peasants needed to survive belonged to lords, and so lords forced peasants to pay to use that land. That's how lords exploited peasants. And then, after the lords enclosed the commons, peasants lost access to the land they depended on for survival, and so now their survival depended on being paid to work as someone's employee, which meant being exploited in a new way. But it was the opposite for working class settlers in Australia. They gained access to land that they needed for survival, and so they refused to work as someone's employee. The horrible irony, though, is that in Australia, this land was being stolen from Indigenous people, and so even as some people were gaining freedom from exploitation, others were having it violently ripped away. But the point remains clear. People cannot be free if they have been dispossessed of the resources that they need to survive and to thrive. This is why, if we want to create a society where we can live free of exploitation and oppression, we need to make sure that economic resources are not owned by anyone. And by economic resources, I mean not just the land and the natural resources, but all of the means of production. The factories, the power plants, the offices and medical centers and laboratories, every source of economic production. Because this is what we use to create all the things that we need to survive and thrive. This is what we depend on to survive and thrive. And nothing and no one should own the things that people depend on, because that gives the owners way too much power over the people who depend on the things they own. It gives them the power to make us dependent on them, and once someone has that power over you, they will also have the power to exploit you, to order you around, and to constrict your freedom. But that raises all kinds of questions, right? Because what would that actually look like? What would it look like to live in a society where there is no ownership of economic resources, right? No private ownership, no state or government ownership, not even like group cooperative ownership like the way it is in workers' co-ops. Like, it sounds nice to imagine a society where everyone has free and equal access to the resources they need to survive and thrive, but how would that work? I attempt to answer these questions at length in my lengthy video, Post-Capitalism, a detailed look at how it could work. In conclusion, the human race has had the foundation of our freedom ripped away from us, and it is time for us to reclaim it. It is an insult to our humanity, and honestly an insult to life itself, to allow ourselves to be dominated. And it is up to us to fight back.
It's game time.
Hi everyone! Thank you for watching this video. And if you want to support me in making more videos, you can rob some banks and send me the money on the dark web. Or if you're not into robbing banks, maybe the weather's not right today, you can also support me in a less dramatic and less traumatic way with monthly donations on patreon.com/OneLuckyBlackCat. Or if you prefer to just give a one-time donation, you can do that on PayPal or Ko-Fi. The links to all these things are in the video description and also on the page of my YouTube channel. And there are also non-financial ways you can support me. Like you could go break into a news studio during a live broadcast and hold all the news anchors hostage until they agree to promote my channel. You know, just a suggestion. That's just a possible way you could help. Or if you're not in the mood for that, you can also help by just telling people about my channel without taking anyone hostage, or you can just share my videos. And speaking of support, I hope that you are getting the support that you need in all the ways that you need it. I know that life can be difficult, and I know that many of us are in pain, so I hope you can find some respite from that. I hope you can still find joy and beauty around you, or within you, or to create joy and beauty when it's scarce. And I hope ultimately that you can find healing, and that we can all find healing. And I hope that one day we can all stand together and refuse to let those in power hurt us anymore, or hurt the ones we love, those we know, and also those we will never know. And that together we can build a new world worthy of the love within our hearts, and worthy of the gift and miracle of life. I guess what I'm saying is, please remember to love yourself and each other. Bye. Bye.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
So, how we lost our freedom? Do you think it will point out to people freedom that's lost that they don't even realise that people ever had, or, you know, they just don't realise the freedom that they are lacking?
Mm-hmm.
Because, like you said, people don't even know how unfree they are. But do you think that the content of this first episode will actually have people saying, oh, fuck, I didn't realise I wasn't free in that way?
God, I hope so.
Well, that would be awesome, because if people, because that should irritate the fuck out of people.
Yeah, I hope people do realize, oh, fuck, I didn't realize how unfree I was or am. And I hope they do feel... I hope they feel more than irritated. I hope they feel angry and wanting to fight.